Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at the JonBenét Ramsey case.
Oh, wow.
You know, one of those cases that really just captivated the world and still kind of baffles us decades later. We're going to be working with excerpts from the Wikipedia article on this case.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it's a really good one.
It's a long one.
It's long. It's really comprehensive. So,
Yeah.
it gives us a lot to work with.
Yeah, I think what always gets me about this is just how much this transcends just like a typical true crime narrative.
Yeah.
It's not just trying to solve a murder. It's about trying to grapple with the idea that sometimes the truth just remains out there.
Right. It's elusive.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So we kind of all know the basic facts of the case, right? 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, she's a young beauty queen, found dead in her family's home in Boulder, Colorado, day after Christmas, 1996. But there's so much more to it than that.
Yeah, there really is. To really understand it, we need to go past those headlines and go into the specifics.
Right, so let's start with the morning of December 26th. Patsy Ramsey calls 911, reports JonBenét missing. But the situation takes a weird turn when she discovers this very lengthy, handwritten ransom note.
Yeah, and that ransom note, with its very oddly specific demand of $118,000, it's become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in this entire case.
Wait, why is the amount so significant?
Well, it was almost identical to John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from the year before, so that detail immediately raises eyebrows, suggests the possibility of someone with insider knowledge. Was it a calculated move by the kidnapper, to try and make the note seem more authentic, or was it just pure coincidence, adding yet another layer to this already perplexing situation?
It's like trying to decipher some kind of code.
Yeah.
Is every detail a clue, or is it a red herring, or just some kind of tragic coincidence?
Totally. And then there's just the note itself, the length of it, the language, the fact that it was written on a pad from the house.
Oh, right, yeah.
All these factors made investigators really question whether or not it was authentic. Could this have been staged?
Yeah. And this is, back before everyone had cell phone security cameras.
Yeah.
So investigators had to rely heavily on physical evidence, witness accounts. And it seemed like, at least initially, things weren't handled as well as they could have been.
Right. Yeah, there were several missteps in that initial response. The fact that JonBenét's body was found by her father in the basement, like hours after police had already searched the house.
And you said the crime scene was contaminated.
Yeah.
So how much of an impact did that have?
A significant one, unfortunately. I mean, having the family moving around the house even unknowingly before forensics could really secure that scene,
Right.
Introduces that risk of evidence being moved or even compromised. It just adds that extra layer of complexity to this already very challenging investigation.
So right from the get-go, we have this confusing mix of, seemingly staged elements and then potentially crucial evidence that might have been mishandled. It's no wonder this case sparks so much debate and speculation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the media got a hold of this story, it quickly became just a national obsession. Every detail scrutinized, every theory was debated, and unfortunately, this very intense public attention just added more pressure to this already strained investigation.
Right. So with so much at stake and evidence pointing in multiple directions, investigators really started to focus on two main theories: the possibility of a family member being involved and the idea of an intruder breaking into the house.
Yeah, both theories have their own supporters and detractors, each with their own interpretation of the evidence.
Okay, let's start with the family member theory. Why were John and Patsy considered suspects?
Well, the lack of forced entry was a big one.
Yeah.
That really led some to believe that someone who knew the house and the family had to have been involved.
Okay, but wouldn't a seasoned intruder know how to get into a house without leaving obvious signs of a break-in?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But coupled with that very unusual ransom note, suspicion naturally fell on the parents, particularly Patsy. Some theories even suggested that she lashed out at JonBenét after a bedwetting incident, which led to her death.
But was there any evidence of that kind of behavior from Patsy in the past?
No, not really. The family dynamics, from what experts could assess at the time, seemed relatively healthy. And there's really no record of Patsy having this history of, uncontrolled anger or anything.
Okay, what about JonBenét's brother, Burke? He was 9 years old at the time.
Right.
Was he ever considered a suspect?
While he was interviewed by investigators, Burke was never officially named as a suspect.
So the focus on the family, particularly the parents, was really just that lack of forced entry and the perception that the ransom note was staged.
Exactly. But as that investigation continued, More evidence was analyzed, and the intruder theory started to gain some traction.
What kind of evidence started pointing to an intruder?
Well, there were a few things. Remember that broken basement window we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
That was considered a possible entry point.
Couldn't that have been staged, though?
It's a good point. It's a valid point. However, the Ramseys neighborhood had experienced over 100 burglaries in the months leading up to the murder.
Oh, wow.
So it suggests that there was at least a pattern of criminal activity in that area.
So the idea was that JonBenét's murder could have been a burglary gone wrong rather than some kind of targeted attack.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And Detective Lou Smith, who was brought onto the case, became a very big proponent of the intruder theory. He believed that the evidence suggested that someone broke in, subdued JonBenét, possibly with a stun gun, and then tried to transport her using a suitcase that was found near the body.
So we kind of have two very different narratives emerging, one focusing on the family, the other on some unknown intruder.
Yeah, and as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, those two narratives would continue to clash as the investigation unfolded, leading to legal battles, false confessions, and ultimately a mystery that remains unsolved to this day.
We left off talking about these two very distinct narratives kind of taking shape.
Yeah.
One focused on the family, the other on an intruder. But with this case, like, blowing up in the media, things got even more complicated.
Yeah, you're not kidding. I mean, the media frenzy around this whole thing was nuts. It was like 204/7 coverage. Every little development, every theory, like every whisper was just amplified and completely dissected.
I remember it. It felt like the whole world was just glued to their TVs waiting for those answers. But did all that attention, did that make it harder to find out what actually happened?
Absolutely. It put so much pressure on the investigators. It just fueled public speculation. And honestly, it probably influenced the direction the investigation even took.
And it wasn't just the media who were, like, scrutinizing every little thing, right? The Ramseys themselves, they were dealing with some serious legal issues too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They ended up filing a bunch of defamation lawsuits against media outlets and people who they thought had made false accusations. So it became this whole other legal battle on top of the actual investigation, which just made things even more confusing.
One of the lawsuits I remember was against the authors and the publisher of that book, JonBenét, inside the Ramsey murder investigation.
Yep, that's the one. It was written by a detective who'd quit the case and a journalist. And it didn't paint the Ramseys in a very good light. The family felt like it just flat out portrayed them as guilty.
So they were dealing with the grief and trauma of losing their daughter, and then on top of that, they had to fight to protect their reputation from these public accusations.
It's just heartbreaking when you think about it. Imagine going through all that, losing your child, and then being treated like the suspect. Just the emotional toll alone.
This case is a real example of how much these high-profile investigations can impact the people involved. What about the investigation itself, though? Did it ever actually lead to any real solid answers?
Well, even after years of looking into it, grand jury investigations, tons of interviews, the case just stayed unsolved. There were some things that happened, though, like that big false confession back in 2006.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That guy, John Mark Carr, he confessed to the murder from Thailand. What was that all about?
Well, at the time, after all those years of nothing, it seemed like a huge breakthrough. But then his DNA didn't match anything from the crime scene, so it all fell apart pretty quickly.
Another dead end. Just another layer of confusion on this already super confusing case. But you mentioned earlier that the investigation is still technically open. What are they even looking at now after all these years?
Well, things have changed a lot, especially with all the advances in DNA technology. Remember that unidentified male DNA profile we talked about before? The one they found on JonBenét's clothes?
Yeah.
That's become like the main focus now.
So they're trying to find whoever that DNA belongs to.
Exactly. And in 2016, there were reports that new forensic analysis of that DNA showed genetic markers from, get this, not one, but two different people, aside from JonBenét herself. So that basically throws a whole new wrench into things.
Two different people. So maybe we were focused on the wrong people this whole time.
It's definitely possible. But of course, it just brings up more questions. Like, were there two intruders? Or could the evidence have been contaminated at some point? Those are the kinds of things investigators are trying to figure out.
It's kind of amazing how DNA technology can change the story of a case like this, even after so many years.
Oh, it's a powerful tool, no question. But like any piece of evidence, you have to be careful how you interpret it, look at it with all the other stuff that's going on.
So even though the case is officially unsolved, there's still a chance that those new DNA findings might finally give us a real answer.
There's always hope. But this case is a pretty strong reminder that even with all this fancy technology, actually finding justice can be really, really complicated. And sometimes the truth just stays out of reach.
You know, it's kind of wild to think that after all these years, the JonBenét Ramsey case still has this hold on us, still fascinates us, still frustrates us.
Yeah.
It's one of those stories that, feels like it came straight out of the news, but it's also this scary reminder of how quickly, like, a seemingly perfect life can fall apart.
And how some mysteries, like no matter how hard we try, they might never be solved.
Right.
But it does give us some valuable lessons, especially when it comes to forensic science, like how powerful it can be, but also its limitations.
You mentioned before how DNA technology has really changed things.
Hmm.
So is there like a real chance that it could be the key to finally figuring out this case?
There's definitely a possibility. I mean, our ability now to analyze DNA that's been degraded or to find those tiny little traces of it on like the smallest objects,
Mm.
it's completely changed how we approach these old cold cases. And as those techniques keep getting better,
Yeah.
who knows what else we might find out?
So it's a race against time then. Can we, unlock those secrets hidden in the evidence before it's too late?
That's the thing, isn't it? We're always pushing the limits of what's scientifically possible, but at the same time, evidence deteriorates, memories fade,
Right.
and sometimes, no matter how much we try, the answers are just out of reach.
But even if we never, like, 100% know for sure who killed JonBenét Ramsey, this case, I mean, it's had a huge impact
Hmm.
on how we look at investigations, how we experience true crime, and even how we think about keeping kids safe.
You're absolutely right. This case just fueled that national obsession with true crime,
Yeah.
sparked all these books, documentaries, and
Uh-huh.
made us really face some uncomfortable questions about our justice system and how the media shapes what people think.
And it made us more aware of how vulnerable kids are,
Yeah.
even in places that seem safe.
For sure, and it really highlighted how important it is to carefully investigate crime scenes and how much we need to keep improving forensic science.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
The tragedy, the mystery, all the theories, the media frenzy, the legal battles. I mean, it's all wrapped up in this one case.
It's a case that just doesn't have simple answers. It makes us realize that we don't know everything and that some things just remain a mystery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What's the thing you hope they'll remember about the JonBenét Ramsey case?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is more than just a whodunit. It's a real human tragedy, a cautionary tale, and it reminds us that trying to get justice, even though it's so important, it can be a really long and complicated process.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes you to places you'd never expect.
It really does. The JonBenét Ramsey case shows us that some mysteries, they might never be fully solved. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking for answers.
Right.
And who knows, maybe someday with, even better technology and a bit of luck, we'll finally be able to close the book on this heartbreaking story. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep that curiosity alive and keep exploring the unknown.